When playing a tabletop RPG, there's always the threat of metagaming a moment. How would a character know the ins and outs of a particular foe? What could they possibly do without breaking the player's immersion to know how to best handle the situation? In some games, you need to metagame a tiny bit just for surface level tactics. Take for example a skeleton. The lack of fleshy areas makes piercing and slashing attacks have little effect, and bones may be brittle and crumble with a good hammer swing that could smash the ribcage. Would you consider that metagaming, or would you consider that a character weighing their options? Within Pathfinder 2nd Edition, therein lies a one-action choice that any player can do to aid them and their team called Recall Knowledge. This one action has a lot of ins and outs that, on the surface, may be a little confusing on how to handle as a GM or as a PC. So this video is a guide on how I personally handle it, and it will hopefully give you inspiration on how to handle it yourself. Let's take a look at the Skeletal Soldier as an example. It is a CR1 foe that a low-level party would likely face. They and every creature in this system have 3 options for recall knowledge: standard skill, unspecific lore, and specific lore. The standard skill for the Skeletal Soldier is Religion at a DC of 15. These lores and the PC's options to take them give them a lot of wiggle room when allocating stats and trained skills. You do not need to be trained to identify a foe, but for every attempt made, the DC will increase. If a barbarian tried to use an untrained religion roll first to identify the foe, the cleric who is trained or better within religion will have a harder time to recall knowledge. This gives players more interesting role-playing potential as they should lean into their particular skill sets over blind hope. These rolls are made secretly by the GM once you've told them your modifier to the skill being used. And since they are done without knowing what number was rolled, you have no way to know if you were off by just 1 or 10, which would result in the DC becoming 2 difficulties harder on a critical failure. These checks are done blind, not just because it makes sense as a gameplay mechanic, but also because of the feat Dubious Knowledge, which, on a failure, the GM gives 1 real and 1 false bit of information that you, the player, now have to act upon. Standard skill lore checks, which is the highest DC available, are common skills that any PC could have access to without needing feats or a particular background. They are things your character would be naturally good at due to their key stat, or selected because of role-playing reasons. Unspecific lores are options you pick through backgrounds, dedications, or feats with a lower DC than a standard skill lore check. For this foe, it would have a DC of 13. As an example, you could have warfare lore given to you through a background that, if used instead of religion, you could try to identify the skeleton and its weaknesses through its armors and weapons. The age they came from, the decay of the leather straps, and rust on the gear. A barbarian would be unlikely to have religion, but could very easily have warfare, and thus still feel very impactful in that moment. And finally, there is specific lore, which is an exact lore pertaining to a narrow amount of entities or foes, but has the easiest DC out of the 3 at DC 10. The Undead Slayer dedication, when selected, grants you 2 lore skills about a specific type of undead you can pick. Let's say one lore is skeletal lore and the other is wraith lore. Skeletal lore applies to only foes who are purely bones and gear, so a zombie with bones protruding from its shambling form doesn't get the option to use skeletal lore, but a skeletal drake would count just as easily as a skeletal soldier. So what does recall knowledge grant? How does this one action and roleplay's choice impact your team's tactics? Let's say the cleric succeeded with using religion to recall knowledge. They get as much info as the GM is willing to give, to which I grant a bit of world lore and 3 to 5 pieces of information. I usually open up with the bestiary's short description, to which this is the skeletal soldiers.
These soldiers continue to follow orders in death, still wielding the armaments they spent a lifetime learning how to use. While frequently made from the bones of humans or dwarves, other types of humanoids are quite common, such as bugbears, hobgoblins, and orcs. Often, these soldiers wield the weapons most commonly used among their people instead of those listed here.
On a basic success, I'd also give a brief summary of some of the foe's skills. For example, the skeletal soldier, being a mindless undead, is surprisingly agile in its armor, and is capable of basic tactics, a remnant of its old life. That small statement reveals 3 bits of information. They have the mindless trait, so mental effects and fears don't impact them at all. Surprisingly agile in its armor means that its best save DC is reflex, and capable of basic tactics means that it could possibly have something like pack attack or attack of opportunity with its weapon. I would also state that its bony body grants it some resistances to piercing and slashing, though with that info being something that the party could figure out on their own, perhaps I would instead give the information that it has resistances to elemental-based damage. When handling a critical success on a lore check though, I'll give about 5 pieces of information at random, but I may also let the player pick 2 that they would like to know. If the player asks for its max health and its worst save, they learn that the skeletal soldier has 16 hit points and its worst save is will, but then also grant the same information as before with more clarity. Like how they have the mindless trait and how that makes them immune to mental effects. It has resistance to elemental damage type by 5, and if it sets up its defenses with a reach weapon, it has the reaction for attack of opportunity until it moves or attacks normally. Learning bits of info makes recall knowledge essential for taking down a vast majority of foes, especially as you reach higher and higher levels. Like learning how to stop a constant health regeneration, what weaknesses a foe may have to allow for more damage, or its best or worst save to know which spells to use against it for the best outcome. This info changes the tactics and options for the party immensely. Knowing that the skeletal soldier has attack of opportunity unless it breaks its defenses means to have the marshals keep their distance and set up their own defenses, while the ranged PCs whittle it down. Party synergy and a solid spread of skills keeps everyone safe, giving the PCs more time in the day as they don't need to stop and heal as often, or maintain resources they would have otherwise spent for another fight. If I was to recommend a time to use this one action ability, it's as soon as combat begins or before it even starts if it can be helped. Though, trying to identify something you haven't seen yet will result in a higher DC from the get-go, or only reveal information that your character would have discovered through their investigation. As a bonus, I've always wanted to make a character whose whole shtick is that they are making a bestiary or monster compendium to sell as a means to retire from being an adventurer. An investigator would be perfect for that, and maybe that will be my next PC video. But until that time comes, I hope you all found this video helpful. Let me know down below in the comments section what other parts to PF2e you'd like to hear my take on. And while you're scrolled down a bit, hit the subscribe and the bell to keep track of my videos whenever I have time to put them out. And until next time folks, may the dice be in your favor.